A lot of space advocates describe space as a blank slate, but there's some serious flaws there. One of which is that space is only a blank slate until humans get there, and humans are not a blank slate. We will be bringing with us all of our preconceived notions about the right way to form a society, and how to live together and how to live with our environment. And we'll bring all of our biases and our vices with us. I don't think we can just count on the fact that space is empty now to guarantee that we'll have utopias in space. We have to do things deliberately to learn from our past, because otherwise we're just going to keep repeating the same mistakes. I like to say that unlike people in the past, we have all of human history to learn from, which is a benefit we should take advantage of.
Hello, and welcome back to Eclectic Spacewalk. I'm your host, Nicholas McKay. Today on Conversations, we are joined by Erika Nesvold. Erika is an astrophysicist, author, and co-founder of Just Space Alliance. Erika's writing focuses on space from the human perspective and asks the question, how will we learn from history, ethics, and the social sciences to build a better future in space? In her book, Off Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space, she highlights the complex ethical challenges that accompany any otherworldly venture, questions about the environment, labor rights, and medical ethics, among others. Erika also co-edited the new anthology, Reclaiming Space, Progressive and Multicultural Visions of Space Exploration, which features 27 original essays that make critical counterpoints to mainstream thinking about space. We also talked about curiosity, science communication, physics simulation, as well as the storytelling power of science fiction and much more. Before we play the episode, I would ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and reach more people, as well as continue to have more interesting discussions with eclectic guests. Also, tell us in the comments what your favorite part of the talk was and who we should invite on next. Now, on to the discussion. So first off, what were you the most curious about growing up? Like what or who in your life really stoked the curiosity flames early on?
I have to admit that, like many people, many astrophysicists, I was a huge science fiction fan. So that
Okay.
included being raised on Star Trek. I was just the right age for The Next Generation, Star Wars movies, read a lot of science fiction, and I get a lot of that from my mom. And of course, science fiction stokes curiosity.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things about the genre. But also, it's so easy to be curious about space because it's so accessible. Right? If you go outside and look at the night sky, assuming that you can see the night sky, there's just so many questions that are piqued anytime you go out at night, and so that's where a lot of my curiosity about space came from, is the stories, but also just the experience of the night sky.
And then was there any more, I mean, you mentioned the cliche kind of Star Trek Star Wars. Is there any specific ones that maybe stick out a little bit more? And then maybe go in a little deeper of why these were so immersive for you. Was it the world building? Was it the character development? Was it the, again, like you said, the accessibility of it's there, but then we're not there just yet? Like what was it really that piqued your interest?
I think the reason that Star Trek as a whole stuck with me, and a lot of the scientists I know, is that I mean, you can point to specific episodes. Star Trek Voyager was very important to me because there was a female captain who became a role model for me. But really, what Star Trek has compared to other science fiction that I watched at the time was a sense of wonder, a sense of fascination with the universe. So there's episodes where they're fighting aliens and dealing with anthropological questions, but there's also a lot where they're just like, oh, look at this neat thing in space. Let's all, as a group, work together to figure out what's going on here. And that really drew me towards the science side of space.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, do you have any particular linking with like feelings of like sublime and awe? Because I think humans are a little bit maybe predisposed to some of that, and seeing vistas on Earth. But I can imagine like seeing the night sky, back in our early times, maybe did something for us, so the wonder and awe.
Absolutely. And whatever it is in our brains, and of course I'm not a neuroscientist, but whatever it is in our brains that makes us feel emotional reactions to beauty, right? And to large vistas. Certainly I experienced that. I experienced that with the night sky. I also love looking at the ocean. I love flying because I like looking down at the earth. And certainly a big part of space is the idea that you can look down on this planet that we all love. And yeah, I think that it's certainly at the root of a lot of this.
Cool. Well, so let's go back to, kind of how you took this curiosity and how you like put it into practice. So you kind of did a PhD in physics, and then, doing a lot of astrophysics. So tell us about your kind of academic journey, and then what kind of made you feel interested in like, okay, now I need to go to the inner workings of outer space or a different discipline, et cetera. Like what made you actually make that move?
So my whole academic career all the way up till now is really a lot of steps that made sense at the time but weren't directed at the point where I am now.
Fair.
In undergrad, I majored in math because I'm very good at math and I enjoyed doing stuff that I'm very good at. So, and it seemed like it would be a useful degree to have for whatever I wanted to do. I considered going pre-med. And then after I finished my math degree, I applied to a few math PhD programs, but I wasn't interested in math as an end in itself.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of at the last minute, I reached out to the physics department at my undergrad university and said, what would it take? What other classes would I need to be able to qualify for this astrophysics PhD? And they said, you're fine. We know you. You can just apply. And so I short-circuited around the process that most people have to take for getting into grad school for astronomy. And then I lucked out again because it was a small department. The astrophysics professors there didn't have a lot of extra grant money for students, but NASA Goddard was right down the road. So, and they have lots of grant money, but no students. So I managed to meet a fantastic advisor there. And that's where I spent most of my PhD years doing my research. So yeah, before I even had a PhD, I got to say, I worked at NASA. I got to watch the JWST be built in the building next to me. I got to meet some astronauts. It was just a fantastic experience. And I got to see the inner workings of NASA, which was also really interesting as a student. One thing it taught me is that I didn't want to be a NASA scientist when I grew up because there's so much heartbreak involved. They spend all this time and blood, sweat, and tears developing missions that then get canceled, and that just seemed a little too excruciating for me. But it was nice to see the behind the scenes. And then skipping ahead to when I was a postdoc, I was working in DC at the Carnegie Institute, and I got the great opportunity to go out to Silicon Valley, Mountain View, California, as part of a NASA program. It was like a 6-week summer program studying planetary defense, defending the Earth against asteroids. And as part of that, they made a point to introduce us to a lot of people in the private space industry out there. This was 2016, so space mining in particular was all the rage right then. So it was exciting because I had been thinking, maybe I want to go into industry. And as a sci-fi fan, I'd always been really fascinated by the idea of space settlement. And a lot of people, including myself, thought that the space industry, building a space economy, is a step in that direction. But then I talked to a bunch of these people, and I ended up really disappointed by a lot of their answers to my questions about the non-technical, non-financial side of these questions. I remember asking one of them who had a lunar mining company, this is still a pretty technical question, actually. I asked him how he was going to prevent contamination of the lunar surface, which is called planetary protection. We don't want to contaminate space with Earth microbes. And he just said, we'll worry about that later. Which was the answer I kept getting. And that didn't feel right to me, because I feel like a lot of times throughout history, that answer leads to terrible problems down the road, or at least a lot of expense if you're doing things at the last minute. But I also recognize that with this, my own history and expertise, math and physics, I didn't have the expertise needed to answer these questions either. So I came back home, and I think we're the same age. You'll empathize with this. I think that I processed all of these questions by making a podcast, which is what millennials 100%. Do. And that podcast is called Making New Worlds. It was a mini series because making a podcast is hard work. But it was a really great experience. I broke down 12 or 13 different topics that were ethics or human rights issues that I expect we'll run into if we try one day to expand human civilization into space. And then I talked to actual experts on those topics on Earth who maybe haven't even thought of their work in the context of space, but have a lot of great insight to share about historical case studies, lessons learned, what works, what doesn't, cautionary tales. And these were people like historians and sociologists and lawyers. And it was a great experience. And through making the podcast, I ended up meeting another astronomer, Lucianne Walkowicz. They had also been thinking along the same lines, and we ended up co-founding a nonprofit called the Just Space Alliance, whose mission is to advocate for a more ethical and inclusive future in space, but also to harness people's excitement for space, to get them to be more aware of these issues here on Earth and to work for a more just and equitable future here on Earth and today. And I also had the opportunity to turn the podcast into a book. So that's my book Off Earth, which just came out almost exactly 2 months ago. And that's an expansion and an update of a lot of what I talked about in the podcast.
Yeah. And so from your technical background, I mean, you had an anecdote in your book, not just the 2016 kind of conference room anecdote, but then also I think you kind of mentioned and correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of alluded to like your very technical background and then kind of having kind of revelatory, almost like importance of the humanities and the fact and the importance in tandem of the hard scientists. So I guess before we kind of get into Off Earth, like, can you kind of just walk us through kind of that journey of like you kind of being in a physical domain or a very technical domain as astrophysics, and then kind of seeing, oh wait, there's some edge cases or some revelatory moments. Can you take us through that process of then you getting to the level of, okay, space has a human perspective as well, you know, et cetera?
Yeah, I like to think that that I didn't have as much of the narrow-mindedness as some STEM people do, but there's certainly a good-natured ribbing between the hard sciences and the social sciences, I'll say, in the university setting, right? And I would occasionally tease my classmates and friends about the squishy sciences and how I remember in particular economics has always really thrown me because it's a very mathematical study, but also involves a human component. And I think the human component just makes these things messy. And so I really enjoyed just taking classes about the technical aspect. And when you look at the private space industry and space science in general, there's a lot of people who are just focused on the technical aspect. And in fact, that's sometimes what draws them to these studies, especially of space. Of all those fields of science, space is the most removed from having to worry about these human issues. I think a lot of astronomers have really just cruised along thinking they don't need to think about human rights or ethics in their work because it's stars, it's cosmology. Why do we have to worry about it's not like chemistry or human biology or ecology, where we do actually have to think really carefully about policy implications and even the effect that your own research can have on the world. But of course, that's starting to change. And there were a few examples of that. One of the big ones for me in grad school was the controversy over Mauna Kea, which is a mountain in Hawaii, where it's a fantastic place to put telescopes, but also this mountain is extremely sacred to the native Hawaiians. And there's an environment that needs protection there as well, and wildlife and such. And so there was a controversy with the TMT, the 30-meter telescope, which was planned to be built there. Native Hawaiian groups started protesting and saying this is a bridge too far at this point. There were already a dozen telescopes up there, and they're still to this day protesting against the outside building of another telescope on the Shaker Mountain. And I read a lot when that controversy started, and that made me realize that even astronomers have to think about these issues, because we live here and work here on Earth, and we use land, we use people for labor. And so that's what started me thinking along these lines. So then and I also recognized at the time that a lot of astronomers were commenting on these issues without being aware of any of the history of colonialism in Hawaii, any of the context they were in, and they ended up saying some very harmful things. So when I started thinking about these issues in the context of space settlement a few years later, I remembered that, and I recognized that I couldn't just make my own podcast where I monologued about what I thought the right thing to do was in space, or I was going to make a lot of the same kind of mistakes. And so it was a great experience to talk to people who did have that kind of experience, not just knowing specific facts about history, but understanding the way to think about history, the way to think about justice in ways that I hadn't been taught, because I was taught how to think about math problems.
Yeah, no, that's and one of my previous guests, Bled Bowen, he has a great book, Original Sin, talking about,
Excellent book.
the militaristic, design and background. And then also one of the things that he mentioned a lot of is like how the colonial past has really infiltrated like launch sites, and the depiction of where they are, not just in localities, but then also, like you were saying, within communities and nested value systems, et cetera. Because like if we look at Hawaii, I mean, that's ripe, for an example of colonialism, exploitation. I mean, recently, I think or not just recently, but with the United States military being there and the groundwater kind of pollution and stuff. It's very interesting that you bring that up, because then there's also, I think, what was it last year, the Arecibo telescope, went basically defunct. And so there's a lot of these things. Yeah. So this historical past, I think, is big. But I think you ask in this question, where is it? Can we do better in space than we've done here on Earth? Like that's a very poignant question. But then also, how can we learn from history, ethics, and the social sciences to build a better future in space? Because there's a lot of like digital natives talk and about making like network states that are just new, and you can move and all this stuff, but then they're bereft of history and locality and groundment. So how can we kind of start talking about that? Like, I guess we can go right into your book, Off Earth: Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space. The notions of motivations, visions, etc. Why did you think, from doing this podcast, so like when did you know that you had a specific book and then you had something like that was coherent? Because like for me, some of the things that I've been coming up with is like, yeah, there's a lot of great talking points, but then now I have to sit down and narrativize it and kind of make something. When did you kind of when did that light bulb click that you had something that was new, but then also you were kind of going to look back into the historical past, etc.?
Oh, I don't know if I to this day think it's coherent, but in fact, I feel a lot like the book is just a bunch of questions without answers. But
Which is
we got to
fair,
start
which it
somewhere.
literally is. I mean, the all, by the way, the table of contents, by the way, are all just questions to people. So
Yep,
maybe you can get
yep,
into
I
that.
embrace
How?
that. Yeah, and I certainly don't think it's comprehensive, but that's just job security. It means that
Yeah,
there's
good
still
point.
plenty of
Good
things
point.
to think about and write about. And I'm sure there's things that I didn't think of because of my own experience and perspective on the world. Um, so you make a good point though about the way that people are imagining futures in space as being these brand new things that we can create. And certainly I grew up on not just science fiction, but a lot of space colonization advocacy. So I read Bob
Oh, sure.
Zubrin's book,
Yeah.
The Case for Mars, growing up, and I heard of J.K. O'Neill and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very excited about that stuff. And then when I started to reanalyze it, when I was working on the podcast, I started recognizing a lot of patterns. And there are social scientists who study the patterns in these narratives. And one thing I noticed is a lot of space advocates describe space as a blank slate where we can start from scratch, design things from the ground up, create a new community to your specifications. If you think, at the moment, the really common thread is libertarianism. If you think
Yep.
that we need
Yep.
to,
Yep.
start over without regulation, we can just go into this wild, wild west free space, then space is the perfect place to do that. But there's some serious flaws there. One of which is that space is only a blank slate until humans get there, and humans are not a blank slate. We will be bringing with us all of our preconceived notions about the right way to form a society, and how to live together and how to live with our environment, and we'll bring all of our biases and our vices with us. So I don't think we can just count on the fact that space is empty now to guarantee that we'll have utopias in space. We have to do things deliberately, to learn from our past, because otherwise we're just going to keep repeating the same mistakes, which isn't just unethical. It's also just kind of a waste of all of this energy. I like to say that unlike people in the past, we have all of human history to learn from, which is a benefit we should take advantage of. So yeah, but anyway, to answer your question, when did I realize I had something? I'm not sure I ever did while I was making the podcast, but and it was certainly a great experience just personally for that. The fact that I recorded it and other people listened to it, that was a nice bonus. But then what it got me mostly was more connections with people who had been thinking about these topics.
Yeah.
And I think that's the most important thing in this field right now. I meet so many people, even now, who reach out to me as a one of the directors of the Just Space Alliance, and they say, "Oh, I've been thinking about these topics and worrying about these topics, but I'm the only one in my department who cared about this." And it's so great to hear that I'm not alone, that I'm not the only one worried about these issues, because it's true. There's so many people who are coming to these realizations from so many different fields, and they just need to be connected to have these conversations and to start building a community to talk about them.
Yeah, and then I won't go just into the next book that you helped edit, called Reclaiming Space: Progressive and Multicultural Visions of Space Exploration, with James S.J. Schwartz and Linda Billings. We'll go into that in a little bit, but first I wanted to keep on off Earth, and so you basically bring it up into 4 sections. How do we begin? How will we live with the land? How will we live with each other? How can we live well? And so it's a very interesting read. It's very accessible. But a lot of this thing, I want to say section 2 and section 3 and most of section 4, if you will pain me, I think a lot of that is based on that science fiction kind of stuff, because all of this, I started just reading from, and we'll get into, because I want to ask you about narratives and storytelling and stuff like that as well. But I was like, red Mars.
Yeah.
Like literally every single question. Well, Ken Stanley Robinson's already kind of got an example of this and this. But I guess the multicultural kind of reclaiming space, I think, is a huge part of your first chunk of Off Earth. How do we begin? Should we settle space? Why are we going? Who gets to go? So I guess, can you kind of talk about those kind of first, because you mentioned the reasonings and kind of the fallacious thinking with some of those things of okay, well, we want to do it for expansion. We want to do it for the inert, et cetera. And then you bring up settler kind of notions, rhetoric. So can you just go through the first section a little bit more deeply, and how we can kind of think about, well, we need to start from a more basic, which I love how you did in the book of okay, let's go back to basics of how do we begin.
So yeah, I think I started the podcast out by saying, why are we doing this in the first place? And I examined those narratives I talked about that I had really grown up on and that I had seen coming back with the growth of the private space industry. Because it's really key that we identify the reasons that we have, either as a society, or if you're in an organization, why your organization wants to go do activities in space, and why we as individuals are motivated. Because if you ask 100 people who think we should work in space and live in space, why, you'll get 100 different answers. But you can't find patterns in them. And the reason that these questions are worth asking is that the motivations that we have will determine what decisions we make and what answers we have to all the rest of these questions. And so I outlined a few. I talked about how the private industry is motivated by profit, because that's what companies are for. They have legal obligations to their shareholders. And so they're going to make decisions based on, is this going to be profitable for the company? Which, as we know, historically has led to things on Earth like labor exploitation and environmental damage. So these are things we need to think about from the regulation side. Yep. Governments have different obligations. They have obligations to their voters, for example, and you can see a lot of this in the different ways that NASA and private companies like SpaceX are developing the same kinds of technology for space. If you compare the SLS with SpaceX's attempt to make the Starship rocket, they're very different processes, and there's been a lot of debate about that recently. But governments are also motivated by things like nationalism and militaristic, as Blood and Bones' book described really well. The original sin of space is this nationalist competition to try to get more military technology in space. And so that's got its pros and cons as well. And I explored a few other reasons for settling space, especially the ones that have come from science fiction. So more futuristic possibilities, hypothetical possibilities, but they all lead to different results. And these affect things like who gets to go to space, which is another chapter. For a long time, the only people who went to space were astronauts selected by NASA or by other countries' space agencies. And so that tended to be a very narrow demographic of people. Initially, it was just test pilots, military test pilots. So you ended up with just a lot of white American men or white Soviet men. NASA has tried to diversify, but they're also still really focused on able-bodied people. So there's extremely strict physical requirements for astronauts. And then along comes the private space industry, space tourism, who says, oh, we're not as strict about that. We don't care about sending disabled people into space. We're going to start off being more diverse because we want to show the world that we're diverse. So we're not just sending white men up there. But they also are charging for the ticket prices. So that's also going to filter who gets to go. And so again, you can see how those motivations play into it. And then the other thing you mentioned is that the very first chapter is asking, should we go to space at all? Should we go and settle space? Should we try to expand our civilization into space? And this was originally one of the last episodes of my podcast. And it was going to be the last chapter of the book. And I decided, no, I really need to move it up front. It's a question I think we should ask at the beginning and at the end of any of these developments of plans for space. And I get asked a lot on these podcasts, well, do you think we should settle space? And personally, I do, because I think that there can be a lot of benefits for the human species, including the ones back on Earth, from the attempt to settle space. And I think I agree with the people who say in the very, very long term, like billions of years long term, we'll have to find a way off this planet if we want the species to survive. But there are people who make really good arguments that maybe we shouldn't, or at least that we shouldn't right now. They argue that our species isn't ready yet. It's not mature enough. We're just going to cause harm to each other and to the space environment if we rush into this. And I think it's worth listening to those people and having those conversations, figuring out what their concerns are and whether there's anything we can do to address those concerns.
You bring up a good point too, of like, not just of the self kind of censorship or self-filtration process and all those kinds of things, but then also I think what we can kind of move on to is Reclaiming Space. Your book, or the edited volume, it's an anthology. So progressive and multicultural visions of space exploration. I think it's key to like what you were talking about before, of like the motivations of it, and then the inherent value systems that are embedded in some of these affordances of not just like the technology that brings us there, but then the social structures that undergird everything. I really want to get your kind of take on how, I guess, you got involved in this project, because I'm assuming you had your own kind of thing, but then as well that must be kind of cool to either get tapped or be involved in kind of this kind of thing. Because to be quite honest, other than the upcoming Routledge social science book on outer space that, you know, is $200 and I'm going to get because it's going to be a doorstop like Bible for me. But then also I started reading and saw Reclaiming Space, and I was like, oh no, this is going to be a Bible as well, like in a certain kind of sense, because I started looking at the essays and the table of contents and just like, whoa, like now this is now we're pushing the forefront of like what it means to be in outer space. I'm going to read just some of it, and you mentioned this in one of your Substack posts. Space from afar, from Africa across the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, contact zones in outer space environments, a feminist archaeological analysis of space habitats, desire, duty, and discrimination. Is there an ethical way to select humans for Noah's Ark? Last one, the language of space. In African space art as a new perspective on space law. Like, okay, bravo.
Right.
Like, you know, like, okay, we're in this now with like, and that's just a small sample of topics. I'll link, you know, the books in the description. Incredible. I mean, it's a who's who of ideas and really thinking at the forefront. So I guess just talk about that experience, what it was like, the process of, you know, now not writing something, but editing 27 original essays, you know. So again, this was a mammoth kind of undertaking, but very important work. So talk us through, you know, how that happened and why it's important.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there's so many people who are working on different aspects of these problems from so many different directions and areas of expertise. I certainly did not invent space ethics, and almost everything that I talked about in the book was inspired by something I had read by people like the contributors to Reclaiming Space. So to start at the beginning of the story, first I'll mention that one of my co-editors, Jim Schwartz, has transitioned since the book came out, and she uses the name Jamie Johnson Schwartz now. So I'll refer to Jamie. So Jamie and Linda have been thinking about putting this book together. Jamie is a philosophy professor at Wichita University, and she had been one of the first philosophers who in the modern era who wrote extensively about space ethics as a field of ethics. She has a couple of good books out with other space ethicists. In particular, she has contributed to writing about the expanse and ethics, which is really cool. And so anyway, she and Linda got together and were thinking about putting this volume together. Linda's been a consultant for NASA and thinking about a lot of these issues for a long time. And they approached the Just Space Alliance, Lucianne and I, and said, would either of you be interested in contributing as an editor to this volume? And Lucianne had too much on their plate, so I said yes. And it was a really interesting experience to be editing a book for the first time at the same time as I was writing a book for the first time. Two very different experiences. So Reclaiming Space was constructed mostly to address a problem I mentioned earlier, which is that most of the public loudest discourse about space settlement and space exploration is kind of dominated these days by a pretty narrow demographic of wealthier Westerners, usually white, usually male, very commonly libertarian and neo-libertarian perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many other perspectives on what space is for and what our future should look like in space. And we just wanted to amplify more of those perspectives and put them out there in the public conversation. All of these people have been writing on these topics and talking about these topics, but we wanted to kind of put them together for people to find. And so, yeah, it was a fantastic experience. It is a little more, I would say, academically written. You can probably tell based on the titles of the chapters that you just read out. Off Earth I really wanted it to be as accessible as possible, and Reclaiming Space is a little more academic, but some of the chapters are extremely accessible. I really enjoyed reading them. And in particular, we included 2 science fiction authors, Mary Robinette Kowal and Vandana Singh, because we all recognize that science fiction authors have been doing this work of space ethics since before humans have been going to space. They've been thinking about not just what it would be like to live in space, but what kind of social complications, what kind of conflicts would come out of that. So we wanted to make sure we acknowledge that. And we tried to include a lot of different perspectives. We failed to include as many perspectives as we should have, and we have it's tough, man. It's like herding cats trying to put.
Is there more like volume
together,
2 already in
order?
No,
there's nothing on the books. There's nothing in writing for that. Of course, it's something we talked about as we were putting the volume together. There's just so much more we're leaving out that needs to be included. We'll see how things go.
Sure.
At the moment, I'm really focused on having these books come out the same year. They actually arrived at my house, the boxes of books, on the same day, even though they're from different publishers, which was funny. It makes me feel like I've said my piece for a little while, right? and what I'm really focused on right now is trying to amplify the voices of all of these other people who are writing about these issues. So that's something I'm interested in pursuing next. But it was a great experience, and I keep looking at it. I got a stack of them over there that I keep looking at. It's a gorgeous book, and I'm really excited for people to read it and to learn more about all of these different people. So there's, you mentioned one of the chapters is by a space archaeologist, Alice Gorman, who does really interesting work. There's tons of artists who contributed to this book. I think artists have a lot to contribute to conversations about space. And of course, they also have their art to contribute, which is great. Science fiction authors, just tons of really interesting perspectives on space.
Yeah, Alice Gorman's interesting. I'm going to try to get her on the pod because she's with she works with Fred Sharman, who we had recently, and they're doing great work with terms of design and space architecture. And habitat.
Alice and Fred and Justin Walsh have recently formed a consulting company called Brick Moon, which is a great name because it's a reference to one of the first science fiction stories about space stations. So
I guess not moving on, I'll just give a quick, so part 1, the evolution and history of spaceflight. Part 2, the art of envisioning space. Part 3, cultural narratives in spaceflight. Part 4, being accountable in the present. Part 5, visions of the further future. I mean, saw a lot of interesting authors that I had known about. Sherry Wells Jensen, very interesting. When I talked to someone in the STS kind of field she had mentioned her, and I didn't even know about this in the kind of crypt techno science movement and stuff. So very cool about that. I guess I don't want to be cliche and obviously ask you an impossible question like, who's your favorite, son or daughter or something, who's your favorite, essay. But I guess what was the one essay maybe, or maybe you can talk about the feeling of being surprised or challenged or something like that. Is there one that particularly stuck out to you?
This is hard to do without looking at the table of contents myself.
No,
like you mentioned, there's 27 chapters.
Good point.
All the ones you mentioned were ones I think I specifically put in a newsletter recently because I think there's especially accessible ones. They're not necessarily my favorite of them. I don't have a favorite, but they are especially accessibly written. Sherry Wells Jensen's chapter is great. So Sherry is a linguist, a xenolinguist, and she is also blind, and she works with Astro Access, which is a really cool organization that is working to figure out how disabled people, what kind of technologies need to be developed for disabled people to live and work in space. And they do really cool programs where they send various disabled participants on parabolic flights. So not all the way to space, but they do those airplane flights to go up and come down, and you get about 30 seconds of weightlessness. And they test things like how does sign language work if you're floating at different orientations to each other, and how do various mobility limitations, how do those work when you're in free fall? And Sherry has been on one of those flights, and it's just really fascinating. I managed to meet her recently in person. I got to see her give a talk. She gives a great talk, so I enjoyed her chapter in particular.
Yeah, and then just even the going further into the, I guess, broader category of what, you know, what constitutes a body, you know, in space, et cetera, and like the physical not, I wouldn't say limitations of the human body, of any human body in space, and how, you know, it affects your bone density and your cornea and all kinds of stuff like that. But I mean, so I guess moving on to a more kind of, I guess, higher level abstract talking about science communication in general. You have a new Substack newsletter, Making New Worlds, which, you know, the same previous name from the podcast.
Yep.
Very accessible, very cool, you know, weekly brain dumps of kind of things thinking about space. Just a few headlines: head in the stars, feet on the ground, lunar barriers and intercultural respect, ethics and NASA's Moon to Mars program, social spin-off technology. So talk us a little bit about, I mean, you have a book, you wrote it, you did the hard work of the podcasting and the ideas, like you said, then you edited a book, trying to, you know, forward, you're part of the Just Space, you know, Alliance, et cetera. How are you kind of envisioning, like you mentioned a second ago, about broadcasting or kind of amplifying other people's work? And then also, how do you see yourself now in this kind of science communicator role? And how do you deal with the issues of responsibility and things like that?
Yeah, you've really nailed it. That I feel like one of my primary goals to have as my purpose in this space is as a science communicator, which is not something I thought of myself much as when I was a scientist. I really enjoyed just sitting behind a computer and coding, which is what I do for my day job. None of this is my day job.
Oh, we'll talk about Universe Sandbox too. So.
But for this, because I don't have this background, this I'll say technical training in things like philosophy or history, I don't feel as qualified to dive into any one specific subfield. But I feel like I've kind of positioned myself to try to explain a lot of these topics at a larger level, a higher level, a broader level, to people like myself thinking about these things and want to maybe see how to apply them to their own work in the technical fields. And so that is my goal. The newsletter, I will admit, came about because my publicist at MIT Press, excellent publicist that I've been able to work with, said, you have to start a newsletter. It's the best way to market a book. And I said, I hate email newsletters. And she said, okay, well, this is my professional advice. So, and I realized I set a very ambitious goal for myself to make a weekly newsletter. I'm starting off at least trying to make a weekly newsletter. It's been running for several months now. Part of the goal was to say, hey, I have a book coming out, you should pre-order it. But then it turned out that I did have a bit more to say. And in particular, I had been kind of stressing about the fact that when you write a book, it takes a while from the moment you write a chapter to the moment it's in someone's hands. It can take a couple of years. And I was writing all this based on podcasts. I'd started back in 2017. So by the time the book came out, it felt a little out of date to me because so much about the space industry is moving so quickly. And so the newsletter also gives me the opportunity to keep up with comments and pointing out different aspects of more recent changes in my own thinking and in the industry as it keeps evolving. I am interested though in using the newsletter at some point once I get a little more organized about it, to do that amplification of voices that I was talking about. One thing I'd like to do with that newsletter, or potentially the Just Space Alliance also has a quarterly newsletter that we try to get guest posts for that newsletter. And so if I manage to build a little platform for myself, which I do have a little platform at this point, I'd love to be able to include Q&As and interviews and guest pieces by all the different people working. I love meeting people working with one of the best things about the Just Space Alliance, Luciana and I talk about this a lot. We have a board of directors. They're fantastic. Alice Gorman is on our board of directors. And our favorite thing every year is when new board members get voted on and we get to talk to them. And we just go, these are just the coolest people. So many great people out there working on so many different aspects of these problems. So yeah, I'm hoping that I can sort of transition into more of an amplification of these voices. because I don't want to just come up with all this stuff myself. That would be a waste. And there's great work being done out there.
Yeah, no, there really is. So, I mean, we won't get into, I guess, personal opinions of the billionaire who owns the platform, but what do you think about kind of these changes of waves of trends of social media, of terms of like amplification of networking effects? Because obviously there's a power there. Obviously I mean, I wouldn't have this podcast without Twitter. Like every single person I've kind of reached out to, engaged with, shared things with, but then at the same time, recently, obviously much more intensely, more recently, is, what are some other alternatives? Obviously seeing Mastodon with a big academic kind of following and et cetera, but then Blue Sky. How are you thinking about not just, I mean, a newsletter, but then in general, like, because you just mentioned kind of Q&As, talks, and interviews. What are you kind of alluding to? Is it more kind of that personal, in real life kind of, hey, like we're in this together kind of thing with a high technical digital background or framework to facilitate that? And so how are you thinking about it, moving forward? Because obviously a Substack newsletter is fantastic, but that also was 2-3 years ago, myself included. So what's kind of the new thing? Is it maybe working in some VR or new kind of mediums? Is it, again, like you said, just amplifying voices consistently? How are you thinking about it in general?
I like your implication that I've thought about this at all. Number one, I do not recommend having a book come out right as the major social media platform for book marketing changes hands.
Good
Not
luck
a choice I would have made. Although it's probably healthier for me because I didn't do as much presence on Twitter as I would have otherwise. And Twitter is honestly kind of unhealthy for anyone's mental health. I got onto Twitter as a scientist because it was a really great way to communicate with other astronomers at 100%. Conferences. And it's been useful for that. And it is still extremely useful for me to be introduced to new ideas and new writers and thinkers. And it's been great for that. However, there's only a small fraction of people in the world who are actually on Twitter. It feels like the whole world because there's so many reporters and scientists and things on there, but it's not the whole world. And so it's been healthy for me to step back and say, okay, where else are people talking about things?
Sure.
Books are certainly one way to do it. There are people who have read my book who haven't thought about any of this stuff just because they're a friend of mine or whatnot. And now they can have these conversations with their peers and they're not on Twitter. They don't subscribe to my newsletter. The newsletter's been great because everyone who's an author with a newsletter will tell you this. People who read your newsletter have opted in to hear your thoughts. So you can at least count on that you're not shouting into a void. But really what I love the most, especially as my work through Just Space. Just Space, we tried being a little more present on social media, but it was very draining for Lucianne and I, who both have day jobs. And it didn't feel the way that we wanted it to feel. And what I realized, I think, is that what I really get out of the Just Space Alliance is the alliance part of it, the network aspect of it. And so conversations are my favorite part. I've really enjoyed podcast interviews as part of this book marketing process more than anything else I've done. Because I love the conversation. I love when people reach out to us from their organizations and say, can we partner with Just Space Alliance? Can we put a project together? And working on projects together, I think, is even better than having a conversation. And we're hoping to do things like other conferences and more meetings in person and virtually, where those conversations and collaborations to actually do work can happen. And to me, that's a better use of my time. It is big use of my time, but it's a better use of my time than coming up with the best marketing strategy on whatever the next big social media network is.
Yeah, true. And so with Just Space Alliance, the mission is to advocate for a more inclusive and ethical future in space and to harness visions of tomorrow for a more just and equitable world today. And so three ways you guys do that: guidance and resources, community engagement, inspiration, and critical thinking. We kind of talked about the community engagement. For resources and guidance, is it more like you were just talking about, like amplifying voices, content, those kind of things? What is kind of the inspirational and critical thinking aspect of that? Because I think also that alludes to what you were talking about before of having still a positivist, optimistic vision of space, and we can still kind of do this with equitability and accessibility, et cetera. So can you go into a little deeper on how you guys are doing that?
So aside from the conferences, I'm working on putting together a virtual conference right now. It's going slowly. It's hard work, but that's something I'm excited about. But we're also working on, we'd like to make more resources for people that, because there are some great resources out there. We've tried to curate some of them on our website. There's also a great great website called the Space Ethic Library that you can go and look at a lot of space resources. But we're trying to build more toolkits for organizations who are trying to do a better job with whatever work they're doing. Lucian right now is working on a couple of exciting projects for that.
Very cool.
So that's one aspect of what we do. And partnership is another one, not just, hey, we want to partner with the Just Space Alliance, but we have a lot of organizations who come to us and say, hey, we're looking for someone who can help us do X. So we're a bunch of engineering students who want to put on an art exhibit about space and engineering. Can you connect us with any artists? And we'll connect them that way. And that's been really rewarding. As for inspiration, this comes a little bit from the second half of our mission statement, which is really important to me. The idea that we're harnessing people's, we say visions of tomorrow, but it's really their excitement for space, to get them to connect with the problems in the world around them. And one thing I found really fascinating, even in myself through doing this work, is that by thinking about these societal issues in the context of space, it lets you escape from the limited worldview that I have on Earth, the limited view of what's possible. One example that I always give from the podcast is about criminal justice in space. I hadn't really ever thought critically about criminal justice. I'm a white American. I haven't had to. And then the more I thought about the issues in space and I talked to criminologists and prison abolitionists, I realized not only are prisons going to be impractical in space, but they're also going to be unethical, and they're unethical in a lot of ways on Earth. So what should we do about that? And by talking to these activists, I realized there are a lot of alternatives to the prison system that would work well in space, which then let me say, well, maybe they'd work well on Earth too. And again, as an American, it's even if you don't think prisons are the best way to do things, it's really hard to imagine how we get there from where we are now. But you can escape that constraint by thinking about this sort of sci-fi context, and it lets you reimagine and come up with more radical solutions on Earth. So that's really what the second half of that mission statement means to me, and that's something that we work on as well. And also just trying to get people to imagine a better future instead of just worrying about dystopias. This is something I've learned from climate change activists, is you can't just scare people and tell people that the world is going to end. I mean, it's important to help them realize the dangers, but if you only do that, then psychologically they just get trapped in indecision and in fear. You have to give them a better future, a better vision of the future to work towards. And that's something I've really taken to heart. And I think that's important when we think about our future in space as well.
Yeah, really, really important points, especially with the connection with sci-fi. And that's a great segue into, you wrote a post, the best sci-fi books on space settlement for 5 books, which for anyone that doesn't know, it's kind of a website that asks, kind of people to curate lists, 5 books and different kind of topics, et cetera, issues. And so space settlements right up your alley, and things like that. So you picked 5 books: Parable of the Talents by Octavia Butler, The Calculating Stars by Mary Robinette Kowal, Cibola Burn by James S.A. Corey, which is part of the science fiction series The Expanse, Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson, and The Word for World is Forest by Ursula K. Le Guin.
I always mess up that title too.
Which is part of the Haynish cycle. So I will give you this, Octavia Butler, incredible author, especially the real post-apocalyptic thoughts. If we want to look at what's going to happen, to Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents. So great books. And I loved your reasoning of why to include them. Haven't the second and third author, haven't heard of that other than The Expanse, obviously. And then Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson. I recently, within the last 3 months, read that. And I'm in Green Mars now. And it is such a mind trip of how everything happened, technology, society, everything. It's literally an incredible piece of work, if you will, in this kind of direction. And then Ursula K. Le Guin, I've heard of this book, but I haven't read it, and I'm very familiar with a lot of her other stuff, especially the Earthsea series. So I won't talk about let's not talk about each one, but I guess let's talk about what each one brought to you. Why did you pick these? And then not just obviously, why didn't you pick others? You know what I mean? What stuck out between these? I mean, Red Mars is probably the most easiest, but then the other ones kind of are noticeable, but why these?
So first I'll say I hadn't heard of this website 5 books before I was invited to do an interview and pick 5, and I love it. You can go, there's cool. Nonfiction authors who, I write productivity books, so here are my favorite 5 favorite books about productivity, or my 5 favorite books about the history of the Roman Empire. But then there's also a lot of fiction ones as well. And so they came to me, a nonfiction author, and they said, what are your five favorite science fiction books about space settlement? Which was actually kind of tough because I'm a huge fan of science fiction, but I wanted to pick some that were about space settlement more than they were about aliens.
Yeah.
And most are about
Good
aliens.
Point. Good point.
In fact, I'm doing another podcast interview soon where we're going to deep dive into my favorite sci-fi book, which is about aliens and not exactly about space settlement. So it's tough to make that distinction.
Okay.
But that's what I was going for here. So Octavia Butler's works, first of all, fantastic, very classic. People refer to them a lot. And those two books are about, it starts with a teenager who invents her own religion, which I could empathize with. But the religion is about why we should colonize space. And it also is set in a very near future climate apocalypse. So I thought it was a fascinating perspective, and talks about why space is important. There's a lot of debates between the characters about whether we should be focused on space or focused on Earth, which is a relevant argument. The Expanse I had to put in there because when I made my podcast, I hadn't read or watched The Expanse. The TV show was still ongoing. And every other conversation I had, every other guest brought it up, and I was like, well, I guess I'm gonna have to watch it now. And I watched
for research purposes, Erika.
Absolutely. It's the best research I did for those books, really. And they're fantastic. And in particular, they touch on themes that I cover in my book, especially about things like labor rights, and also about the fact that people who are born and raised in low gravity might end up being unable to come back to a high gravity environment like Earth, and that could really lead to prejudices and various factions, and I thought that was really fascinating. Mary Robinette Kowal, who wrote the Lady Astronaut series, was one of the contributors to Reclaiming Space.
Very cool. Okay.
I invited her because I was a fan of these books.
Yep.
And she does it's sort of an alternate history where in the 1950s, right as the space program is getting going, a meteor hits DC and the world's going to end in 50, 100 years because it's not going to be habitable anymore because of all the dust. And the space program suddenly has this new purpose. This new reason is they need to be able to go and colonize other planets. And it looks at how the Mercury and Apollo programs would have been different if they had stuck with some of their original plans to really go to Moon and Mars. And what if they had included more women, which they didn't bother to do with the real world. But if you're trying to settle space, you need to include women. So that's a great, very fascinating. And Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars, I also read because people kept bringing it up.
Yeah, me too.
I'll say if you're a fan of The Martian, you might like Red Mars because he very much focused on how would we actually do this technologically. I think the only sci-fi technology he came up with is he expanded their lifespans a bit so that the same characters could stick around for all three books. It's also great for fans of geology because he spends a lot of time describing the Martian landscape.
Pages about this strata and this and that. I mean, it is very visual. It is very visual and immersive. Yeah. And then what about Ursula K. Le Guin? Because that's a book also I haven't been just yet, but then people have mentioned this a bunch.
Yes. So the Word for Wilderness Forest is not the most famous from the Hainish cycle, which is a series of books that you can read in any order. That includes, I think, The Left-Handed Darkness, which is probably one of her most famous books. But it's also about aliens. It's my one that really includes aliens heavily, which it's about a logging company, not even a mining company, a human logging company that goes to this planet where another sentient species lives in the forest and does really terrible things to those people, and enslaves them, makes them work for them, doesn't consider them to be people. And it's about the uprising among the native people. And it's also about one thing I think is really interesting is there's a human character who's nice to the native people and kind of on their side, but really doesn't end up helping them much. And so I think it's an interesting perspective on colonialism, and there's a lot of that theme in science fiction when it comes to aliens. So I wanted to include a little bit of that in there.
So if these are books now, just that we'll play a lightning round. What's any other medium or any other kind of thing, science fiction that's kind of get out to you, space settlement? I mean, for me, like for sci-fi, I love like Arrival because it gives like an antagonistic and a little, it's not like dystopian by any means, you know? And that's hard to, there's not a lot of those going around. So do you have any other, maybe like, because you can't pick like Blade Runner or something like that, you know? So like,
right. Well, I mean, I have favorite sci-fi things that aren't about space settlement.
yeah,
That's the
good
problem,
point,
is
good
trying to
point.
narrow that
This
down.
is
I
also a
will
problem.
say one genre of television that I really liked since I was a kid that is not necessarily science fiction, but it's very connected to what I'm interested in with space settlement, is all of the genres of I don't know, we'll call them shipwreck stories, where a group of humans arrives in a new place and has to figure out how to build a little society for themselves because they've been shipwrecked, for example. So I really liked the early days of Survivor because I thought that's what it was going to be about. And then it was not really about that. I really liked Lost, which ended up being science fiction, but was initially about here's a bunch of people in a new place that they have to, it's a harsh environment, they have to survive together. How are they going to do it? And there's so many stories that explore that. Sometimes they're science fiction and sometimes they're not. So I like that genre as well, and I think it's applicable.
Okay, well, second to last question. So tell us a little bit now, since we went all about space ethics and everything. Tell us a little bit about your day job, and then also tell us a little bit about Universe Sandbox. A Universe Sandbox is a physics-based space simulator. Quote, it merges gravity, climate, collision, and material interactions to reveal the beauty of our universe and the fragility of our planet. I haven't played it yet, but it is on our Steam download or watch list, so we'll be downloading it soon. But tell us a little bit about that, you know, and what you're doing now since you've written the book and you have your weekly newsletter and you're doing it all. What is next?
So I'll say that about, I think 12 years ago now, a video game programmer named Dan Dixon, who was my boss, put together, he coded up a little, an N-body integrator, which is how you write a gravity simulation. It's how you simulate orbits in particular, but also the way that things collide together. And he whipped up a little one. He made it pretty because he's a video game designer, not a physicist. Astronomers do not make their code pretty. And he decided he was just going to make it for his job portfolio to get a job. And then he put it up on Steam and it sold so well that he decided to hire a few people to make a better version of it. And several years later, he hired me as one of those people. And we've just been improving it ever since. And from my side of the story, I had been working as a research scientist. I was a postdoc at the time, and all of my research had been computational astrophysics. I wrote gravity simulations, I wrote collision simulations, and I really enjoyed it, but I didn't like writing grant proposals. And so I was looking for a job in industry, and I found a job opening. They were looking for another astrophysicist. There had been a few astrophysicists who had worked on the project, and they're constantly adding new simulation features, more things that the game can simulate, not just orbits, not just collisions, although that's pretty cool. I've been working on things like I made the gravity, the galaxy dynamics better, so galaxies look more accurate. And lately I've been working a lot on the surface simulation. So you can add water to the surface, you can watch it freeze or dry up or have tidal waves. I'm adding other materials now so you can simulate life eventually. And and I just love it because I get to keep learning new physics instead of just drilling into one specific subject. And I get to code them up in a simulation, which is something I love to do. And I don't have to write grant proposals. And the best part is that someone else does the graphics, and it's just gorgeous. I don't know if you've watched the game trailer or anything, but the graphics are really beautiful. Sometimes we talk about why do the users play this game? Because it's not a normal game. It's not like there's achievements or a quest or anything. There's no characters. And I think one of the reasons that some users do it is it's a great artistic medium. You can just make really, really gorgeous images and videos out of it. But you can also experiment. It's like a little astronomy laboratory. You can say things like, what if I replace the sun with a black hole? What would happen? So I love it.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's really, really taking the experimental thing to the T. And we don't have enough time to talk about it, but I'm assuming that you might be interested in the No Man's Sky and those kind of game development and stuff like that.
I've played No Man's Sky. I actually wasn't a gamer when they hired me. I said that in an interview, and they said, "Well, it takes all kinds." But after I got hired,
will become one. Yeah,
right. And after I got hired, like reading The Expanse, I realized, I'm going to have to play some video games. So now that I'm in the industry, so I played No Man's Sky and The Outer Wilds, which is another
Okay.
fantastic game, and I've played Kerbal Space Program and things like that.
Okay. Well, there's many of the different mediums of this, but so the last question, at Eclectic Spacewalk for Conversations, I always ask my guests, because the overview effect was a very profound kind of experience for me to think philosophically, socially, etc. And we already talked about rethinking the overview effect with Jordan Bim as well. So with your perspective and my kind of thought process of Eclectic Spacewalk, of seeing the Earth from space through an eclectic kind of lens of edge cases, of misfits, etc. How can we join, or like, what can I ask you to think about, or what would you say of how can we kind of view the overview effect through a quote off-Earth space ethics perspective, along with quote commitments to progressive and multicultural visions of space exploration? How can we merge kind of all these kind of things together, or what are just your kind of parting thoughts on the idea of our place in space, human, not just human settlements and what that means, but then how we think about space, our visions of space?
That's a really big question, so I'm going to answer a slightly
Great.
smaller one, which is what are my thoughts on the overview effect through the lens of off Earth. And I of course also find the overview effect, the idea of it, really fascinating. The idea that when astronauts and other people go up into space and look down at the Earth with no borders, it changes them profoundly and perhaps makes them better at thinking about our future as a species. I've also now done a bunch of research and interviews with other people who study the overview effect, and sociologists, for example, who study religion and science and the overlap of religion and science. There's a couple of really great ones. I'll mention Deanna Weibel and Mary Jane Rubenstein are both great people to read on that subject. And their research has shown that the overview effect is not universal. Pardon the pun, I guess. But some people go up there and they don't experience that. Some astronauts just go, oh, I'm supposed to feel something, but I don't. And I think that as cool as the overview effect is, and as much as there are some groups who are saying, oh, we should put more people into space, regular people, politicians, we should all get them this view so we can be better people. I think that there's a little fallacy there that I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that if we just go into space, we'll just be better somehow.
Yep.
And I don't think that's true. I think space has a lot of potential to introduce us to new ideas and new experiences, but we can't just coast up to space and go, okay, we're better now. We didn't have to put any effort into us. I think we also have to make deliberate effort to think about what does the overview effect tell us, and what can we learn from it, and what does it mean about how we should intentionally work to be better, even if we don't feel that awe-filled feeling.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've had similar things of like, at first it was more looking out and out and to the expansive universe and stuff. And then throughout, it's almost like that. I don't know if you're familiar with Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, or, and so it was kind of like that for me. It was like, I thought I was going out into this great beyond, but then basically just wanted to turn around and come back, and like keep grounded here on Earth. So yeah, well said. This has been amazing. This has been a great podcast. Your book, Off Earth, Ethical Questions and Quandaries for Living in Outer Space, and then also the edited volume, Reclaiming Space, Progressive and Multicultural Visions of Space Exploration. Thanks so much for coming on Conversations, Erika. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was a great conversation.
Thanks so much to Erika Nesvold. She is a fierce advocate for a more inclusive and ethical future in space and harnessing visions of tomorrow for a more just and equitable world today. We hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as we did. Now, before we go, please like this video if you found the discussion generative and intriguing. Leave a comment about your favorite part of the episode or who we should interview next, and subscribe for more eclectic content. Until next time, ad Astra.